Hey writers, it's Mrs. McDermott, and I am here to take you through a lesson on how to use dialogue in your personal narratives. So, when we're thinking about good personal narratives, one of the things that we have talked about in class is that we want to help readers picture the episode with kind of zooming in, right? We talked about that yesterday. Zooming in, taking that action and really slowing it down and describing all the parts of what happened in this moment. And so, look at this little section that I kind of pulled out of this guide that we're using for personal narratives. And you can see that it says we want to help the readers picture the episode. We want to take that small action and use exact dialogue. We want to climb inside the moment and write within the narrator's point of view. And you are the narrator. This is your personal narrative. And then we also want to make the characters in our personal narrative say the words and use the tone that shows who they are as a person and hints at the bigger meaning of the moment. So hopefully you can see those things and kind of think about that as we move through today. How can I help my readers picture this episode and tell them about some of the characters or the people that I know who are in this narrative? So we're going to be talking about dialogue, and it's going to add so much interest to your writing, and we're really excited for you to try it out. Again, we know this is kind of new to you. You haven't probably worked a lot with dialogue, but we're excited for you to give it a try. All right. So dialogue is a conversation between two or more characters in the story. All right. And quotation marks surround or kind of hug what is actually being said. So if you look back at a piece from our kind of model narrative, everything will be okay. Here's an example of dialogue. This animal is filled with disease, she says. We can't touch it. We can't let it touch anything in the house. We'll take it to Dr. Milk, I say. He'll make it better. And you can see the two people who are talking, right? We have Mom, who says this animal is filled with disease. We can't let it touch anything in this house. And then we have James, the writer. We'll take it to Dr. Milk. He'll make it better. All right. And so the words that are actually said out loud are hugged by these quotation marks. And then we have the he should, she said, the he said, she said part. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of these different terms and how we're going to make dialogue work. So, two important things to know, two important terms to know when we talk about dialogue is the term quotation marks, okay? And we use air quotes, and we also, in our writing, will use real quotation marks. And these are going to hug what's actually being said out loud. The other term that I want you to know is the term tagline. And tagline is a phrase that shows who says the dialogue, the he said, she said part. So here's an example from our story. Again, don't worry, Smokey. I tell the kitten inside. I won't let anything bad happen to you. I don't care how sick you are. So we have the words that are actually said out loud. That's the dialogue inside the quotation marks. And then here's the tagline. I tell the kitten inside, or she said, or he yelled, right? So those are the taglines. So when we talk about taglines, those are not hugged by parentheses because they're not actually being said. Okay, so that's called our tagline. And here are just a few things that we think dialogue should do. We're not requiring you to have dialogue just because we think that you should try it and just put some quotation marks any old place, right? Dialogue serves a purpose in our writing. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday when we talked about zooming in. But dialogue should also reveal character relationships. We see the relationship between James and his mom through the dialogue in that scene. We know that he trusts her and goes to her for help. It also should reveal what the characters want to happen, what they wish to happen, things that they might be thinking out loud. It helps the reader find out about character traits, and then it also will help the plot move forward, right? It might increase the suspense in certain scenes, and it should always be realistic and believable. So when you're thinking about places to add dialogue, these are the things that you should be thinking that may be helped in your writing as you add dialogue in. So, hi, she said. Hi, he replied. How are you? She asked. I'm okay, he replied. How are you? I just fell asleep reading this. This is me reading your story on my computer. I'm sleeping. This dialogue does not propel the storyline. Yes, it is dialogue. These are things that people are saying out loud. But yesterday when we talked about parts that you wanted to zoom past, this would be one of those conversations that you would want to zoom past. You don't learn anything about the characters. You don't learn anything about the plot through this. It's just dialogue for the sake of dialogue, and it's not doing anything to make your story more interesting. Okay, so when we say add dialogue, we don't just want you to put random dialogue in. Okay, I guess this is good practice for dialogue, but it doesn't add to your story. And we never want to just add things into our story that don't help the reader or don't make it more interesting. So let's take a look. My dog is getting into Christmas presents. Awesome. Okay, so let's take a look at this example from Everything Will Be Okay. Come on, Paul says in his take charge voice. Get that box now. Bring it on in here. He flicks on the light in the waiting room. You're coming back here with me, he commands. I'll need your help. What are you going to do? I ask. What do you think? He says. You heard your mother. That kitten is sick. Bad sick. She's your mother too. All right. I actually think this is a great piece of dialogue. Now, remember on the slide before this, I said, what should dialogue do, right? It should reveal relationships. It should reveal characters, thoughts, and feelings. It should help us find out about the characters and who the characters are. It should move our plot forward. It should increase suspense. And it should be realistic. It should be things that it sounds like would actually come out of people's mouth. So what I think this is a great piece of dialogue is it shows a lot of these things. First of all, it shows the relationship between James and Paul. It shows this older, younger brother dynamic. You can tell when Paul demands, get that box, bring it on in here. He's trying to be the boss of the situation, right? And James is a little bit sassy when he says, she's your mother too, right? He's starting to be able to talk back a little bit, which definitely leans toward what this story was ultimately about, which is figuring out who he is as a boy and who he wants to be as a man. This also might tell us a little bit about Paul's character, in that he seems kind of heartless, don't you think? Instead of telling his little brother in a kind way when James asks, what are you going to do? He says, what do you think? That doesn't seem like a very compassionate way to talk about the death of this animal, especially when he knows his brother wants to save it and keep it as a pet. And sadly, this also propels the plot forward. We know at this point that the kitten is going to be put down. And even though it's the last thing James wants for his pet, it's going to happen. So it's creating suspense, and it's realistic. It sounds like things that two kids would say to each other, right? So there are a few dialogue rules that we want you to follow. And when you are starting out working with dialogue, these are things that you are not going to memorize. You just won't. You'll practice them, and you will use kind of cheat sheets that we give you to help make sure that you are punctuating correctly and paragraphing correctly and doing all those things. Eventually, as you mature and grow as a reader and as a writer, and the more writing you do, you'll get better at it, and things will start to seem a little more intuitive, but right now you're going to need some help. So you won't memorize how to use this. It's really kind of complicated. So when you are working today and on your work in the future, I want you to pull up this Dialogue Students Reference Sheet. It's contained in today's lesson. It's a PDF in that folder, so you can just pull this up, put it on your screen as you're working in your writer's notebook today, or print it out if you have a printer, and put it next to your computer as you're typing, so that you make sure that you punctuate correctly and appropriately. So this is going to be your model, and you should really pull it up when you're working today. So the first thing I want to show you is here's an example of the dialogue that is being said, and then the tagline at the end. All right, so we have in quotation marks what the character actually says. I want some ice cream. We have a comma placed here because we know the tagline is going to be after it. And then we have Mary said, and here's where our period goes. Okay, so this is an example of punctuation in dialogue when you put the tagline at the end. Writers can also practice putting the tagline at the beginning. So here you have Mary said, and then your comma is here. I want to get some ice cream. Period goes inside the quotation marks at the end, right? And then we have this hugging what is being said. Again, guys, you will use the cheat sheet that is in Schoology to help you punctuate correctly. All right, so think about, write it down first, and then go back and see, how should my punctuation look? And use these as models, and then add your punctuation. Good writers also might try to put the tagline in the middle of dialogue to break up their dialogue. And here's an example of that. Quotation marks go around all the words that the characters say, even if it's interrupted by that tagline. So you have, well, said Mary, I want ice cream. Okay, so here is our punctuation for interrupting taglines. Some other rules that I want you to remember when you are adding dialogue, besides just punctuation, is that every time someone new speaks, you need a new paragraph, which means you're going to hit the enter or the return key, whatever it says on your device. You can see clearly in this example from Everything Will Be Okay, when Paul or James are speaking to each other, there's a new paragraph. Come on, Paul says in his take charge voice, get that box now, bring it on in here. He flicks on the light in the waiting room. You're coming back here with me, he commands. I'll need your help. What are you going to do? I ask. What do you think? He says. You heard your mother. That kitten is sick, bad sick. She's your mother too. So look, you can see them taking turns, right? You have Paul, come in here. What are you going to do? Says James. Paul says, what do you think? She's your mother too, says James, okay? And you can also see that when you have only two characters talking to each other, you can sometimes drop the tagline or the he said, she said part. So if you start off saying, here's Paul, right? Here's me. What are you going to do? I ask. He says, what do you think? Then we know that James is saying the she's your mother too part. And there's no tagline behind that because we know this is a conversation between Paul and James and Paul and James. And if you see that new paragraph, you know it's a new speaker. So as you're going on, the longer your dialogue continues, you might want to think about dropping taglines. If it's just a couple of exchanges, you should probably always contain or always have some of those taglines in there. But if it goes on for a while, you can drop them toward the end as long as it's just between two people speaking. Okay? Direct quotations always begin with a capital letter. So he said, comma, see you at the tournament. So even though it's part of this sentence, you are still going to capitalize what is in the dialogue. When we're talking about taglines too, here's kind of a pro tip, is that there are hundreds of different words that you can use besides said. So you're going to think about showing your readers what's happening, not just telling them. And so pick a word for said that actually helps them see what is happening, how the word is being spoken. Is it being shrieked? Is it stammered, right? Is it jeered? Is the person giggling or gushing, right? Or babbling on and on? Is it a question? Are you asking something, right? So these are all 100 different ways that you can say said, and I'm sure there are more than 100, but this chart is also found in today's lesson folder. So while you're writing, and if you're thinking about ways that you can spice up your writing and be more precise, which is what we're always trying to be as writers, you can use some of these terms in your own dialogue today. All right. The other type of dialogue that I want to talk to you about is internal dialogue. And good writers use it in their writing to help do the same thing that dialogue does, which is to help people picture the episode, to climb inside that moment and see what's happening in the narrator's point of view, and to make characters say the words and use the tone that their personality hints at. So you can also bring your readers into your mind as the narrator of your piece, of your personal narrative. And here's how it kind of looks. Here's how James Howe uses it in Everything Will Be Okay. And do you see how the author shows what he's thinking? It's not actually coming out of his mouth, but the writer is using italics to show the words that he's thinking in his head. And there are still some taglines, quote unquote, but this is a really cool thing that you can also try in your narratives. So inner dialogue is shown here in this piece. I found it in the woods at the end of my street where I play most days with my friends. This time I was alone. Lucky for you I was, I think. Otherwise David or Claude might have decided you'd be good practice for their slingshots. Those two can be so mean, I think to myself. I don't like playing with them really, but they live at the end of the street, and sometimes you just play with the kids on your same street, even if they're mean, sometimes even to you. So you can see here, lucky for you I was, he's thinking in his head, right? Otherwise David or Claude might have used you for slingshot practice. Yikes, right? So he's thinking that in his head. He is showing us what's going on in his mind. And you'll notice that the tagline here, I think, is not in quotation marks because he didn't think, lucky for you I was, I think, right? He said, lucky for you. All right. So here's an example of how you can use inner dialogue. And what we want you to do for today is to find a place in your writing where you can fit in dialogue. And this is one of the things that you're receiving points for. So it's really important that you do this today. So first of all, if you want to practice writing it in your writer's notebook, come up with at least 3 exchanges of dialogue. And I'll show you what that means in a second. You should have your student reference sheet out so that you can see how to punctuate, okay? And it will help you punctuate. Remembering that every time somebody talks, it's a new paragraph. And we also want you to find at least one place where you can add internal dialogue. So find a spot in your narrative where you think, oh yeah, I probably was thinking this, right? And add that using italics. Then you're going to take a picture of your work and you'll put it in your digital notebook, and you'll then go to your narrative draft and type it up. All right. And here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about examples of 3 exchanges of dialogue. So person 1 says one thing, person 2 says another thing, and then it could be a third person, or it could be the first person who talks saying another thing. So here you can see 1, 2, 3. You'll have 3 paragraphs at least. Okay. And you're going to have at least 2 people speaking. Okay, now obviously you can have way more than 3 exchanges. We're just saying we want you to try at least to show a conversation where somebody says, okay? And then here's an example of internal dialogue. I'm going to do it. I'm going to ask my mom for a cat, I thought to myself, I was preparing to hear the harsh, firm no, but I was going to go for it. Okay, so then you can see these are the thoughts, the actual thoughts going through this narrator's head. All right, off you go. Have fun inserting dialogue. We want to see changes not only in your digital notebook, but we want to see the changes reflected on your personal narrative. We're getting towards the end, and this is going to make just so much more interest. It's going to add so much more interest to our writing and realism. All right, off you go. Bye.